I want you all, if you trust me, to close your eyes, and we are going to go on a journey together. So I want you to imagine the youngest person in your life today. They got a little gap tooth smile, little laugh. How do they look? And I want you to, in your head, create the dopest, flyest time travel machine that is going to take you 50 years into the future. What kind of rims does it have? Does it play your favorite music? Do you need a little AC to be comfortable? Now open up the door of that time machine and step on in, waving goodbye to that youngest person in your life. Close the door. Do you have a revolutionary jam playing? You might want to crank it up. We're going 50 years into the future. You've landed. Might have a little bump. You open the door, and who's there to greet you but the youngest person in your life 50 years later? How's their smile now? They're about to show you the new world. They look to you and they say, thank you, because you helped to build this. How does that feel? Take in a breath and let it out. They're showing you around. What does it look like? What does freedom sound like? What does it feel like? What do you see? Do you see crises teams that are helping folks? Do you see the Marcus alert that was created? Do you not see white supremacist monuments? What does freedom feel like? All right? The youngest person in your life is saying thank you. And it's time for you to head back to that time machine. But before you go, look out one more time. Look out into this world that you are helping to create here in 2020. Take a deep breath in. Let it out. It's time to go back. So we open the door of the time machine and step in. Crank up that revolutionary jam one more time. And off we go. 50 years back to 2020. When you're ready to come back into the fight and build that world, you can open your eyes.
Prefacing the guest that we're going to have on today, Kalia Harris, we are going to talk a little bit about decolonization work and decolonizing your mind and what that really means to all of us. Seba, Mikey, Steven, and I'm Star, we're going to have like a little dialogue and get into that. So first, when talking about decolonization, I feel like that's a big word that's been used a lot, especially recently, but I guess a definition for that could be the practice of recentering ourselves, our values, and our lives away from colonial norms. So when we're decolonizing, we're recentering our focus away from what white supremacy has built, institutions that it has built to serve itself, and really centering our focus within ourselves and then also our communities. When we are doing decolonization work, we're reclaiming our narratives, resources, land, practices, away from the oppressor and also away from white supremacy. So here we can honor what our ancestors have done, what our community has done, the movements that have happened before this time, while also looking towards to what we do to continue that work. How do we honor our ancestors through our movement, through our actions, and also how do we create a world that those, you know, ahead of us will also be able to enjoy?
Yeah, so I think that decolonization has become kind of a buzzword, and I think we have to like realize that we have our own unique like responses to that. I think for me, decolonization in that process has become looking through like the ways in which I've learned things, the ways I've been taught things, and analyzing it from a different perspective. I think it's really important for people who are like getting new into this process and really trying to like increase their critical thought about how we're taught things, why we're taught things, and like in the manner of which we're taught things. Like trying to do that in your own unique way. Like for me, I know I'm like a content scrubber. Like I'll read everything and try and learn that way. But like looking at it through your own lens, like I think is really important too. If you're an artist, you can decolonize through art. If you're a writer, you can do that through writing. So like knowing your space really helps. So I just implore anyone like going through this process to really think about that. And I also want to talk about like how decolonization affects us, because every aspect of our life really is affected by post-colonial ideals. Like the way you ascend in our society is through establishment of success in the workforce or through higher education, both of which are kind of like symbols of white supremacy, in the sense that the establishment of going to long work days and schooling that's gate kept is meant in the form of oppression. So I think acknowledging that, liberating yourself from that, and acknowledging other ways, maybe perhaps alternative ways in which you can find that solace is really important.
Right, because I think there's another piece to decolonization, not just in the world that we see as like institutions, you know, systems of government, not just in what we're seeing physically in the world, but also within ourselves. And I think that's a piece with decolonization work that is super important. You have to really do the work within yourself to uproot what you know. Why am I policing other people's actions? Why can't I, you know, acknowledge and validate someone's pronouns? Why do I have these feelings of frustration when I'm corrected or when, you know, I'm given advice by others? So I definitely think it's important to really tease that out and uproot those notions that we've been socialized to know our whole lives, but also kind of indoctrinated to know and understand as real. You know, whose voice created this notion that we uplift so much? You know, is it, you know, a white supremacist? Is it a colonizer? Or is it really coming from the community? Is it coming from what you know to be true and coming from yourself? And I think that also works in the way that we see ourselves. Like decolonization work in body image and confidence and things like that.
I think also addressing too kind of the perspective in which a lot of us are taught. It comes through the eyes of the oppressor directly.
Right.
And I would like to note that, you know, this isn't unintentional. This is intentional work that's being done to systematically dissolve the rights and the capabilities of marginalized folks. And in that sort of same vein, it's a method of disconnecting people from their communities. And when we're disconnecting people from communities, we start to disestablish collective power in that sort of way.
Right.
So I think innately understanding that colonialism and the process of colonization is to, you know, disestablish systems of power from communities of color, marginalized communities, indigenous communities, queer communities. These are all things that are seen as a threat to the white supremacist ideals that are being upheld currently. And this isn't unintentional. This is directly intentional. And I think when we start to realize that, you know, these actions do have, you know, the work behind it. This isn't something that's done in necessarily covert. It's something that's done through establishing trust and through the education process, through socialization. These are things that we really have to dig deep in and understand that these are things we were raised into, and it's for some people it's uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable. Decolonization is an uncomfortable process. It's a hard process. It's a lengthy process. Knowing that, acknowledging that it's there and taking the steps to do it, I think is really important. I would also like to say too, acknowledging the trust you have in yourself and your lived experiences, and the experiences that you have are valid. It's something that we're taught, that the struggles that we face are not, that they're as a result of our fault, you know, our guilt, our problems. we also have to establish that these are directly correlated to systems of supremacy and oppression that have been pushed onto us. These are results. These are not causations for specific issues. Decolonization work in that way is also kind of loving yourself, respecting yourself, trusting yourself, and really knowing who you are. And also, if you don't know who you are, getting to the root of that, taking the time to acknowledge that maybe I don't understand where I fit in right now, but I'm working to get to that point.
Right. And I love that so much, because really, in my experience, and I think for everyone, another piece you have to take with it is decolonization really is healing. It really is centering your own narrative and believing yourself and believing exactly what you feel. I think for me, my decolonization work really hit its peak when I started to realize that the things that I think about myself and how hard I am on myself, how intensely I push myself to produce, is not necessarily, it was placed on me. Doing the act of trying to heal myself, but also looking back and seeing how my family hasn't healed themselves. I have to stop that cycle with me. I can't pass that on to the next person. So very much so, healing is a huge part of it. Decolonization is radical love, and radical love for yourself and for your peers, your community, your comrades. And that is so important, definitely, to validate. So yeah, Stephen, thank you so much for making that point. That was really beautiful.
Appreciate it. I also think too, like kind of going off what you were saying, just not analyzing yourself based off of the productivity or the outputs that you're putting out.
Right.
You are the input and you are the output. And I feel like a lot of times, especially in white supremacist systems where, capitalism thrives and the necessity for producing is the value that you're inherently based on. Mikey was saying a little bit earlier, talking about the workforce and how, success is determined by the capability of you to do the work that you're doing. No, it's not. Work is something that it's something that you just do, and you shouldn't be valued based on a system which intends for you to produce and produce and produce. So I wanted to ask you guys too, I think, we're talking about decolonization and decolonizing your mind. But our curriculum framework is, Project Decolonization Education. So in what ways do you think you can take steps essentially to start decolonizing specifically the education process that we're involved in? Because it is largely one that's backed by capitalist outputs and also just white supremacy in its core.
So I think the plain and simple of it is like recognizing inherent biases with the education system. If we're talking about like our project in particular, we're trying to educate a lot of college students. So like acknowledging the gatekeeping tendencies that higher education produces. There's a reason why people from these Ivy League schools, a lot of them go to college preparatory schools because their parents are able to pay for them to have the best education. And then if you look at like marginalized communities, schools without accreditation, like a lot of times it's not that these students aren't of the same intelligence level. And I feel like that notion is really prevalent in society, especially when it comes to higher education. And I think that's just plainly rooted in racism. But I also think that like when you look at these communities, it's not like they don't have the ability. It's that the resources there are so gatekept and so underutilized and given. And I think like something like I personally, like with my decolonization process, has really understood is that there's these mechanisms of white supremacy that have stated that if you belong to the other, if you are not imbued with the fairest of skin, you are the other and you are to be suppressed. And I think those mechanisms have seeped into like what we're talking about with education, and not just like higher education, also like public schools. Like if you look at Richmond public schools, we're so underfunded, and it's predominantly in Black schools and predominantly in schools that have high immigration populations. So I think like acknowledging that these inherent biases, which seemed like people were just, I guess the notion has also changed, because it seems like maybe 10, 15 years ago, people would say, oh, you're just complaining. But it's like, no, this has always been here. These problems have always been present, and acknowledging them is par for the course now. So I think like us having these discussions is really important when it comes to decolonizing education. Also, like if you look at the ideals that we were taught as children, like Christopher Columbus, like Leif Erikson, like Genghis Khan, like right. These people, like I was taught that they were like these beautiful like people who were trying to share their culture, but they're really just colonizers, and they were taking people from like our cultures back home, and like indentured servitude and slavery, and like having all of these things they become more to the fore, I think really allows like the decolonization process.
No, definitely. I think too in education, it's a lot about like informally, definitely finding your voice. And, you know, being in, especially with VCU, being in those courses and talking about, okay, well, like whose stories are we reading here? And who is controlling this narrative? And how is this discussion being facilitated? I definitely think don't be afraid to question everything, you know, and really, I know it's daunting, but questioning professors, questioning administrators is so important because like we are a part of this process too, but also a lot of us have the stories and the narratives that these people are teaching about. And the biggest times that I've felt like I betrayed myself is when I allowed someone to silence me because, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. I do know what I'm talking about because I've lived this. Like me, my community, my peers, my ancestors, this is life or death for us. So no, you know, my narrative isn't research based, but it's real because it's a lived experience and we've lived it.
I think for people of color especially, or just
Right.
marginalized indigenous individuals, queer communities, you know, like decolonization isn't a choice. You know,
Yeah.
It's something that you have to start to working on, because otherwise there are a lot of innate negative results of
Right.
the colonization process. You know, it's not a coincidence that marginalized communities are the ones that face issues, especially in terms of like mental health or even just access to health resources. These are things that have been set to suppress marginalized communities, and so trusting your lived experience, I think, is a necessary part to it, and also, you know, taking the time for yourself, because you know decolonization work isn't easy.
Our first guest today is our mentor and spiritual guide through all of our activism over the last 2 years. It's Miss Kalia Harris. She's the co-host of Race Capital, a popular podcast in the Richmond community, which discusses the fabrics of racial narratives and injustices going on in our communities, as well as being an organizer for the Virginia Student Power Network.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me on the show. The first show.
We appreciate you
Yes.
coming on.
Yes. I'm ready to, plant some seeds in the radical garden.
Yes, plant those radical seeds.
So we wanted to make sure that we brought you on today because we know, especially the work that we're doing, we've been with you doing this work for 2 years, and you've been helping guide us and really shape a lot of our ideas about specific things at VCU, also in the community. And we wanted to really make sure that we, honored you giving so much wisdom and information to us. And so what we wanted to start with is we just wanted to ask a bit about your experience with organizing, potentially your origins with that, whether it be in educational settings or educational institutions like GMU or in the RVA community.
Yeah, so I am from the Richmond, Chesterfield area. So my activism and organizing started in high school, where I started an African American student union at Cosby High School. That got a lot of pushback. And then when I went into college at George Mason in Fairfax, I got really involved with Black Lives Matter, really organizing both on campus and in the community, and really got radicalized through my travels, through my peers and comrades, learning from students from Palestine, just lots of different students and different issues, undocumented students. And we all still kind of organize together now, but learning together on campus at Mason. And so that's how we got started. We ended up releasing demands to our university as Black students. And fast forward to today, a lot of those lessons that I learned organizing on campus at Mason are, the lessons that I'm teaching to you all, and also the same things that we enact in the streets day to day. So whether it's putting out demands and continuing to escalate around them, or it's doing a teach-in, these are the similar tools and tactics that we learned when we were in school as well. And what you'll see now is that from Virginia Student Power Network, a lot of those organizers that were, doing work on their campuses back in 2015, 2016, some of us still work for the organization, but a lot of us are working for other organization or legislature, or really, affecting that change in different ways. And so we really respect the diversity of tactics. And so when I see my comrades out there doing their work, it's really encouraging, because then I come back and work with y'all, right? And we have people that we can learn from together and really model solidarity and what that looks like across movements and across efforts.
You've done a lot of work with us, like organizing as formerly a student and on VCU's campus with student organizing, but also you are a member of the community. So are there any differences there when you are on campus rather than when you're in community with your neighbors, peers, whatnot?
Pretty similar, because you have to educate your peers about the issues that you're advocating for. You build demands, you escalate on those demands, and you keep the pressure up. And so that is, the formula, whether you're on campus or in the streets or in the community. Sometimes it just looks really different because students want to learn. They come, they want a class, they want it to be in a book, they want it to be manufactured in a certain way. And so the way that activism looks on campus sometimes looks a lot different than in the community. It's a lot easier to do the relational work, and you have to build a lot of trust, especially as students, you have to build that trust. And so those are the differences and the nuances, I would say, but the formula is the same. Demands, organize, educate, agitate, keep it popping. But yeah, there's some different ingredients that go into the recipes on campus versus off campus.
And in tandem with that, I guess I wanted to ask, what would some tips you would have for maybe new organizers, even current organizers, even people that have been doing this work for quite some time? What are some tips that you would have?
I would say humility is so important. And understanding that ego has no role in the movement for justice for anybody's lives, right? And so I think that if we're moving from a place of love and desire for true liberation, it doesn't matter if your organization's name is on something. It doesn't matter if it's you're a student or you're a community member, because we realize that solidarity is the base of our work and not our name and ego. So I think that's been the biggest lesson I've learned. And if you realize that, you have no problem passing the mic to someone else that maybe could speak to something better than you or has been directly impacted by an issue. We all have a role, and it's not always our role to have the mic. And so as organizers, whether new or old, I think it's really important to realize that, because when you're new, you're super excited because you're mad, you're hyped, somebody handed you a megaphone, you might want to speak, but really taking a moment and thinking, is this my space to speak? Is this a space that I need to take up at all? Or is it better suited for someone who is more directly impacted and can speak to this? And that's the same lesson that older organizers also need to learn, as well as being open to the youth voice. It might not sound the same. It might not be the same message, and it might not be the same approach or tactic that perhaps folks in the past used. But if they got the mic and they're using it and they're spreading their message the way that they want to spread it, I think older organizers have to do their part to make it an intergenerational movement.
Thank you for sharing those tips. It's definitely really important coming from someone so experienced, and helped us out through so much from the beginning. I mean, I remember we were struggling out there trying to see how we should talk to the administration and kind of getting scared. But now, we're out there and we're all doing the work together. And I think that's very important.
Y'all always have been doing the work. And I think that that's part of what's important for people to know listening to this, is that the No Policing and Mental Health campaign is, about over 2 years old. That agitation and that work came from you all agitating the administration, having lots of meetings and telling them that it was time to remove those services from each other. And that came from your own personal experience. So while, we've provided mentorship, the power of students to come together and actually create solutions is something that I don't want to be taken away from you all. And to implore other students that as we're talking about getting rid of the police, we have students on your campus that, you know, have the blueprint, that are willing to do this work. So y'all, please listen to these student power students, because they are actually building student power.
I just want to like talk about too, like about when we were like organizing on campus, and one of like the most memorable conversations that we had with you was before the town hall, and we had walked you through our outline, and we were like so nervous, and we were like almost kind of like abandoning like ourselves in a way, because it wasn't our voice, because we just wanted so badly to be like acknowledged by admin, and like after like 2 years of doing this work, like we wanted that acknowledgement, I guess, in a way. You told us like, you know, never change yourself for them. Like this is not like your voice, and they are not your intended audience. So I was wondering if you could like talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a tension, right? Where you want to speak the language of the people at the table, and try to like conform into this box of what you think will be acceptable to them. This is what we call respectability politics, right? Where you want to be as respectable as possible to be respected. And what we know is that the system does not respect us as people. The university sees students as consumers rather than actual people to be educated. So in that moment, you know, we were kind of building like a syllabus, you know, we're trying to get all the files together and make sure that everything was so perfect for administrators that Michael Rao, he didn't even have the time of day to come and hear this. And so I think it's important to know that the audience of organizers, while it is to change the power structures and target them and get change, it's also to empower the people that the communities that we're a part of, and making sure that they know they have a voice. Because at the end of that town hall, we had a whole nother like dozens of students that felt like they could email Michael Rao or put a post up and it wasn't wrong because the message was there. And so, yes, to new organizers, yes, your job is to target. Yes, it is to pressure. And we try to make these changes, whether it's city council or, you know, the board of visitors at VCU. But our job is to educate and build relationships. So that's why Virginia Student Power Network always talks about relational organizing as the way to go. It's not just about come to my meeting, come to my town hall, like my post. No, it's about how are you doing? What does liberation mean to you? How can we get there together? What does a safe VCU look like? What does actually a one VCU mean if we were to really embody that? Relational organizing is just basically what I was modeling in that moment and telling y'all that like, it's not about them. It's about us, and it's about building power for us. And it's also like, it's a confidence thing. Right? Like you get scared, shook to the core. Even I do I used to when I would go to speak at council. I spoke at like the US Capitol Hill, and y'all, like the fear that you feel, the imposter syndrome, like we're young people, we're not supposed to be in this space. You know, our voices are not usually validated in those spaces. Taking that power back, because it is our space. And that's what Reclamation is truly all about.
I think I was just going to add on, like, again, bringing the interpersonal relationship back that you talked about. I think it really ties in with everything. It's like the overarching theme as well of like building that relationship with people. You're not just meeting them once and then never talking to them again. It's getting to know who they are and where they come from and their background. I think that's really important. I think a lot of the new organizers should like take that away from this conversation as well, along with a lot of many important points that you mentioned. But I definitely think that's a very important point. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and going off of that, like I think it's so important to keep that in mind, and also what you were saying earlier about like the idea of ego being like the enemy, and like the contra to what we're trying to actually like establish. Because when we talk about all these processes, like the decolonization process, which has a lot, I know all of us personally, to really thrive in the system where we're challenging the white supremacy or the institutional systems that have affected our communities. And that, like we talk about, that VCU often has a huge part in like dropping that and like really decolonizing your mind and what that means. If there's any way you could talk about that. to a deeper degree, that'd be greatly appreciated too.
Yeah, I think that decolonization, especially like that word gets thrown around every which way, especially in the university setting. And so something about me when I was at George Mason for my undergrad degree, I was the president of the Native American and Indigenous Alliance. And this is actually before I even had learned of my own like Indigenous heritage, which came years afterwards. But learning about colonization and settler colonialism and what Western culture has done to us, especially with capitalism, or should I say racial capitalism. We produce and we produce and we produce, and it's all about production. So when we think about decolonizing our minds and the work, that kind of gets back to what we say in the streets of getting the cops out of our head. That means not policing ourselves and others. It also makes us have to think about, like, are we producing just to produce? Or are we trying to build something meaningful for the future? And that's very hard to do while also still operating under a racial capitalist system because we have to survive, right? But I think that the ego part is something that we have control over. We can control how we organize with other people, how we interact with people, who uses our work, who doesn't use our work, and what our boundaries are. And so those are some of the beginning steps of what I would think to think about with decolonization, but also in practice. So like doing land acknowledgements, building with Indigenous folks in this community, that is also a big part of decolonization. So whether it's reaching out to the Richmond Indigenous Society and making connections with actual Indigenous folks in the community, and not just doing a land acknowledgement, because, I'm sure that VCU will take that in a heartbeat and start putting that in their syllabi without ever actually giving back or giving reparations to people who have done this work. But it means like meaningfully giving reparations, whether that is your time, your money, for VCU, perhaps your land, and these tuition dollars back to the people. That's what that looks like. And as students, we are in classes, right? Y'all are in a lot of classes that have this dominant Western culture, whether it's your social work classes, science, medical, like racism and colonization is entrenched into all of those different disciplines. And so we can also be pushing back on that even in the classroom, looking at these racist theories by white men and saying, why can't we have a Black or Indigenous source here? And really questioning these professors or getting a class canceled. That's perhaps profiting on the pandemic and protest and struggle that we're going through in this city. Like, those are things that are decolonization practice. And so that's what that looks like to me. We could talk about that all day, though.
We definitely could. I also wanted to ask, for Student Power Radio, our intention is to facilitate conversations both between VCU students and the community members. So maybe for people that this is the first time having discussions about, settler colonialism, decolonization, about abolition, where do you think that students fall in kind of the spectrum of boundaries in terms of acknowledging community demands and also acknowledging community efforts that are ongoing?
So if you applied to a school and you joined that community, your duty is to stand in solidarity with those community members. So I think that while it may involve a lot of learning, a lot of active listening, a lot of researching to learn the history and orient yourself to that community, students definitely have a role. So not just going to your orientation event put on by VCU, but maybe going to some community events as well. If you're coming back to campus during this uprising in Richmond and you acting like the uprising isn't happening, you got a duty to play. Everyone has a role to play. Like, this is not just let's go to class and pretend like things are not happening. And even before this pandemic, they have a duty to atone in some ways for the violence that the existence of VCU inflicts upon the community. And so really that looks like going to, like I said, community events, doing readings, listening to podcasts, making relationships with folks that aren't just on campus. Like VCU sits in the middle of our city, so it's a lot easier than, say, Mason, which is a bubble, to meet these folks. But just like y'all have done, have dinner with someone, get to know folks, and don't just go on social media like bragging about it. Just do it to do it. And I think that that's the back to the ego convo, but that's the role that y'all have to play. And yes, sharing those demands, standing for Marcus David Peters, who was also a VCU student, and seeing that solidarity is really our role. My last tip is to go out and learn about a struggle that might not impact you directly, because you'll find that it does in some ways impact your life because it impacts someone else. So if that's learning about the Palestinian struggle, whether it's the fight for Black lives, whether it's the plight of our undocumented students on VCU's campus, really learning about these things, because folks are out here teaching, and part of the university experience is learning. And what you'll learn after you graduate, like I'm learning, is that you are a lifelong learner.
Because I think it's like super important to note that like even the stuff we learn in school, like who wrote that? Whose narrative is that centering around? I think that's what's so rewarding and also important about, like you said, going out into the community and meeting different people, is that you'll hear the narratives of those that are really affected, especially like in the Richmond community. But also too, it's incredibly healing to exchange narratives with people, to actively listen to someone else's story, because someone else's story that they're willing to tell you is a gift, and they don't have to. It takes a lot of effort and work to recount that. So I think there's that healing process to it, and that's what we've been able to hear, especially from like having you as our like mentor. I think it's been super awesome.
Yes, this is a Black feminist practice, y'all. Oral storytelling has been in cultures for a long time, so it's us reclaiming that and not letting white people tell our stories, because that's what they're going to make money off in the universities next century. So let's tell our stories now. At Race Capital, we call this media justice. So I'm really excited to see y'all go forth with media justice here on Student Power Radio.
I also wanted just to ask really quickly, what are some things that you're reading? What are some resources you may have for people that are looking to get a little bit more radicalized? What are some things you're looking at? Maybe some plugs. I know Race Capital is also one, but yeah.
Yes, right now I am reading a few things. I'm reading They Were Her Property, which is about white women as slave owners in the American South. I'm also reading the Black Power Mixtape, which is about Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement. And I was also revisiting one of my favorite books, Sister Citizen, the other day. And that one is about the stereotypes of Black women and mythologies. And it's by Melissa Harris Perry. So those are some really good books. I also really implore folks, if you're really new to this defunding the police conversation, The End of Policing is really good. Y'all gonna have to put this in the bottom because I'm gonna mess up everybody's names. But The End of Policing, and then we also have Anything Angela Davis, right? I would personally suggest, while her readings are amazing, just checking out her speeches on YouTube. I go to sleep to them sometimes, but they're really good for kind of giving you language to some of this stuff that may be really new. So check out those sources, and y'all know I'm a scholar, so you can always hit me up and I will give you more sources for days.
Special thank you to Kalia Harris, our organizing mentor. Thank you for having this facilitated discussion with us and really sharing some wisdom about everything we've done and that you've been doing in the community, sharing resources. We really appreciate having you on. Thank you very much.
Thank y'all for having me.
We'll now be hearing from Mikey, who's going to be talking a little bit about the history of oppression, gentrification, and performative inclusion done by VCU, and the history of student activism at VCU.
Thank you. So with decolonizing education as a whole, I think it's imperative that we discuss the mechanisms that we are using to enact the change that we see so fit. So I think the predominant way we do this is through student organization and activism. I think it's important that we also acknowledge the history thereof. It's our duty to build off the backs of the people who have laid the foundations of student activism. As students, we have to know our space and our place. And I think like understanding the history of what people before us have done in their radical spaces and then sharing that to influence like our own radical spaces is really important, because we weren't the first students to organize protests and actions, and we're not going to be the last. So I think knowing our space and place and understanding the history is really important. I think it's also important to note, like, the Greensboro sit-ins of the 1960s, when those 4 NCAT students walked into that Woolworths, they knew they were going to make a change, and they sat and they did it. And 10 years later, Kent State did it too. The next decade, it was Tiananmen Square in China. After that, it was in Iran. After that, it was in Croatia, and now we're here. So I think that, like, it's important to understand that students all over the world have taken a stand against oppression and against things that they see so not fit. So I think it's really important for us to understand that it is our space and place. And I think going to like our own experience here at VCU, we also have to realize that just 5 years ago, we had a bunch of brave student activists on campus walk into Michael Rouse' office and demand that change. So I think in order to really call ourselves activists and student organizers, we have to recognize those people, and we have to recognize everything that they've done. At VCU, it's really important to acknowledge that as students of a public university here in Virginia, we are the constituents. We are the people who at the end of the day have the right to say, we're not going to stand up for ableism. We're not going to stand up for white supremacy being taught on our campus. We're not going to stand up for gender and sexual orientation discrimination. So I think like with decolonization in the education process and in like organization, all of that has to come to play. And I also think something that we just talked about with Kalia, talking about like the inherent privilege we have as students, it's our duty to acknowledge the impact that VCU has on its community. VCU is an active gentrifier in the city. VCU is displacing homeless people at a clip that's unimaginable every year, and also demonizing those homeless people for being displaced. So I think understanding that, working in your community, like really getting out there and doing the nitty-gritty work that may not seem the most glossy or glamorous work to do is really what we as student organizers need to be doing. We have the power to talk to our board of visitors. We have the power to talk to Michael Rouse. We have the power to talk to the cabinet with our professors. And we have the power to really let our voices be known. And that's like what I advocate for when it comes to like student organizing and student activism. Like, we are the history of what we create. So if we don't create that history and make it in the way that we want, we're going to allow these systems of oppression that have hurt our people for so long continue. So I think it's really just important that we really like we have these discussions.
Right. No, I definitely think, like we said, like speaking something into existence, it gives some power to it. So we have to have these hard facilitated discussions, because if we're not having them on campus, who is? Who will? Admin? BOV? Route? Absolutely not.
It's clear that also the motivation for them, it's like not even on like a capitalism level, but on a capitalism level, it's like the motivation is that students are seen as like as these cash cows. And like I know something that I've talked about at length is that it seems to me as if VCU wants their black and brown students for brochures and not to be actual members of the student population. And that's where it's like really, really, it's negligent, because if you look at us, we have one of the most diverse student populations in all of the country. We have one of the least diverse teacher populations in the country. That's what those students 5 years ago who walked into Michael Rouse's office were talking about. They were talking about the fact that 5% of all teachers at VCU were African American. Like, that's unacceptable. So I think like representation for us as people of color is so important. And I think that's like where we're talking about disconnect when it comes to like education. Representation means everything, at least to me. So for them to not even acknowledge that representation is a huge sense of like strife and confusion and like just conflict as a student here at VCU. It's like, I chose to go to the school because it was inclusive. But then when I got here, I realized that we're not really that inclusive.
Right.
And we'll talk, I think, a little bit about it a bit later, but I also wanted to bring up the sort of necessity for student activists and student organizers to really understand the fundamental issues that their campuses are doing to the community.
Yes.
And working in tandem with that, because I think we can also pay, like, obviously we should pay respect and honor those student activists that came before us, but also just community organizers in general. Those, a lot of times, like, we're fighting for issues on campus too, but make sure you're not just calling out injustices just on your campus, and call them out in your communities too. Right. Because as a member of the VCU family, you're part of Richmond, you're part of RVA, and I think it's really negligent, to address issues that are going on in your circles, but not really addressing issues that are going on directly in your communities and environments.
A lot of times, like our own student population won't respect the very places that they're in. Like, if you're here in this radical space and you're promoting like inclusion and diversity, but you're not also talking about like loving the people who are in your community, your homeless population. If you're not the homeless population in your community, if you're not taking care of all those people, don't talk about being a radical person or like really caring about inclusion and all that stuff, because it starts at home.
Right.
And Richmond is home before VCU. Like, you have to acknowledge your space and place.
Right.
You also have to acknowledge the history, like I-95 has a history of displacing thousands of Black residents in the 50s and 60s. So like, I think acknowledging that, knowing the history of Richmond, also, and educating yourself on that is so powerful as well in the decolonization process.
Right. We can't repeat the actions of the colonizers and the oppressors, and we can't leave anyone behind. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of this work, if it's not inclusive, if everyone's voice isn't heard, then what are we doing? Because we're trying to build this new world, this community rooted in collective power. And if it is not a collective, then we have to imagine a world outside of what we're living now. Mm-hmm. And what we're living now is not inclusive at all.
Mm-hmm.
We'll now be hearing from Seba, who'll be talking a little bit about our organization, Student Power at BCU, and our journey, as well as the work that we've done with the community.
Yeah, so we started off with Student Power, with No Policing Mental Health. And it was back in the summer of 2018 where it all began. And when we first started, it was a struggle. It was pretty hard to kind of see where everyone is at and what people are thinking around this, because right when we started it, people were like, no policing in mental health. Like, whoa, like, what if this happens or what if that happens? Like, people were just like bringing up a lot of these excuses and starting to see how that would work. We three main demands that we had out there were hiring more counselors, replacing cops with mental health professionals for wellness checks, and separating the dispatches for the crisis call between VCPD and the counseling services. So those were the main demands that we started off with. And just having no policing in our title, people were just like putting us in this box that whenever we went to administration meeting, they would just shut their ears off, because they were just like, that's not possible, because we don't know what it would look like without that. And so we faced a lot of backlash or a lot of pushback from the administration, but also from some members too. But now, like, when we're actively working with divesting away from VCPD and RPD, people are starting to now understand it, but it's also that kind of frustration in the beginning when we were pushing out for it. It was really tough. When we had those administration meetings, there were multiple times when we provided so many recommendations to them how to separate policing out of mental health. And multiple times they would respond to us back by saying, that's not possible. All these universities include police officers. That's just how it works. They ensure safety. We don't have enough funding. And these were all of the excuses that they would often use against us. Or they would also tell us that, hey, if you want social workers or those mental health professionals that you're talking about, why don't y'all go ahead and find those and then come back to us? So those were a lot of the pushbacks that we had with this campaign. And it was really frustrating in the beginning, and especially when it was just a couple of us, like 5 or 6 of us, trying to talk to other people and trying to tell them about why it's important, especially with our first conversation that we had about decolonizing the mind. People don't still understand why we're doing this. So we have to make sure that we're all kind of in the same place when we're pushing forward for these demands. But now, after these 2 years of fighting for no policing and mental health, we are way beyond that. We are seeing VCU co-opting so many narratives. We are seeing them putting out this public safety model. And that was something that we already mentioned to them about replacing police officers with mental health professionals. And now they're like, oh, we're going to push forward for that. But when we mentioned it 2 years ago, y'all didn't say anything. We were here and we would get these backlash responses that they just don't have enough space. And that's the problem.
I think going off of that, to highlight the frustration of like our no policing and mental health campaign, we're not upset because VCU is honestly, I'm not even upset that they're trying to take the win for a separation of dispatch and mental health services. Like, the problem is, I know so many people within those 2 years that we've been trying to fight for this, when you were denying us and like saying, oh, this isn't a possibility. So many people have had to go through mental crises and have police show up at their door. Like, it's a constant thing. And like, the thing that really was enlightening about like the whole process of no policing and mental health was I interviewed upwards of 30 to 40 people, like, and just had them give their experience about university counseling services. And with no exaggeration, there's not one single person who told me a positive experience they had with university counseling services. And I think like, especially when we're talking about the most marginalized communities at VCU, like Black and Brown, disabled, queer folk, like a lot of those communities, there's already a stigmatization of the mental health process, and definitely a stigmatization of the policing process. So to meld them together and force students to experience not only negative mental health crises, but like an exaggeration and an amplification that VCU, like the administration, is personally making it worse, and then for 2 years to deny that, and then also to take the credit for it. We're not crying woe is me. We're saying a wrong is a wrong, and you had 2 years to fix it, and nothing happened.
Another thing that is just generally frustrating is that these changes aren't proactive changes. You know, they're retroactive changes that involve an issue having come up and then the necessity to change that based on a larger thing. Even though these solutions have already been proposed before, these solutions, like the amount of research and work that we, our organization as well as other organizations on campus have put into providing these resources for administrators and then not having them heard and then having them co-opt, solutions to things going forward. It's just generally frustrating because it shouldn't be on the responsibility of the students to do these things. It should be on the responsibility of the systems to address itself internally. And so we'll talk a little bit about it more so on our next podcast, really getting into the nitty gritty of the new public safety model and what that is. But we also had released around when it was about prior to COVID-19 and that whole situation ongoing, our organization had released a list of demands to VCU administration in tandem with both community demands and also with other organizations and students on campus. And a lot of these changes were made, taking direct narratives specifically from our list of demands. Although when we did propose the list of demands, it was essentially, shot down. I think it's just negligible to the experience of people that are doing this work, that are continuing to do this work, to have these narratives co-opted.
Right. I think, and the most important thing, I think, especially for students that are new to this, is that all these acts are intentional. If we have this belief that these institutions are going to protect us, or, if they do something wrong, they didn't really mean it. No, they mean it. And now the question is, okay, well, when you're co-opting these narratives at this point, and you're instituting this like public safety model, what work are you doing to make it so it actually does protect Black and Brown communities? It actually does, protect folks that are really feeling and experience marginalization from VCU as an institution. And I think that's the biggest frustration to me, and what Mikey had said about, VCU really only cares about Black and Brown students when they're on the pamphlets, when it's VCU freshman orientation and they're talking about diversity and inclusion, but not really instituting it on campus. So for me, who are you protecting? Like, who are you serving here? Because it clearly is not the students you claim to love and have space for. Really what you're doing is upholding white supremacy, and you're upholding capitalism. You only do the right thing when it's convenient and it fiscally makes sense. And for us, it's not good enough. And I don't think that we as students have to accept that.
It's performative inclusion. And it's like saying, it's so self-aggrandizing to be like, oh, we care. But then do we not have ICE on our campus all the time? Because we do. Also, do we not have one of the largest metropolitan police forces for any university in the country? We do.
And
In fact, the reason I know that is because if you Google it, they're bragging about it. Also, like legitimately, if you look at the city of Norfolk and ODU, they say they have slightly over 55 police officers. That's according to their website. VCU is bragging about the fact that in Richmond, only at VCU, we have 99 police forces. They talk about the fact that they have one of the largest university policing forces. And it's like, that is like a direct infliction of harm on the Black and brown communities. If you really want to care about Black and brown communities, get them out, get ICE out of campus. There's like a hearing. So I'm talking to like all the new organizers, like be present for that. Like that's next month. There's a hearing in the city of Richmond talking about the expansion of VCU into the greater Richmond area, VCU police into the greater Richmond area. So if you really care about that, go speak on that.
I think too, another necessity is I touched on it just a little bit earlier, but the necessity of universities to do the work to address the harm that they've done both to the community and also most affected folks. And so I think when we're talking about that, one thing is that they're doing protections for Black and brown students, but what about queer students on campus? What about disabled students on campus? What about Indigenous students on campus? What about undocumented students on campus? Right. And so I think, addressing situations and solutions to one specific thing, Star, you talked about it earlier, in this sort of like radical space and creating a new radical world, you can't leave people behind. Right. It's just a bit negligent to the experience when the universities ask you to do the work for one specific one specific thing, but it's their responsibility to make sure that all of their students are supported and all of their community members are supported as well.
All these people have PhDs, period. All these people have PhDs. All of these people are very well educated, and you can't do the work.
So I think it's a necessity in terms of specifically student activism to really understand the community demands and the community work that's already being put in. And so when we're talking about these community demands, it's really important that we understand them and we fundamentally understand the necessity for them. So some community demands currently that are occurring with community organizations that VCU students specifically and just students in general should be supporting in their communities in the Richmond community is to institute and fully fund the Marcus Alert system. This is a system proposed by individuals and organizations that did work directly after Marcus David Peters was murdered by Richmond Police Department 2 years ago for having a mental health crisis. Marcus David Peters was a VCU alumni, and it's negligent on the fact of VCU not to include even the name of Marcus David Peters in any sort of statement or any sort of informational release. And so instituting and fully funding the Marcus Alert system. And then we want to make sure that we're working in tandem with the community and releasing the names of all Richmond Police Department officers under investigation for use of misconduct. And that whether that be in terms of relatively recent against protesters, also in the past, these are individuals that are directly oppressing our community, that are directly oppressing our students, because we know very directly that VCU PD is consistently out harassing protesters with Richmond Police Department. So we want to make sure we're holding both responsible. So releasing the names of all Richmond Police Department officers under investigation use of misconduct, and that goes in tandem with VCU as well. VCU needs to release that as well. Dropping the charges against protesters. We stand in solidarity with the protesters that are doing the work and engaging in actions on the ground in Richmond that are continuously pushing to stop from systematic oppression. Defunding the Richmond Police Department and defunding the VCU Police Department and funding Black futures. When we say that, we're talking about education, housing, health. These are the reallocation of funds through the abolition of police forces, through the abolition of prison systems, through the abolition of ICE, through the abolition of the court system, systems that are systematically oppressed Richmond communities and Black Indigenous and people of color communities. And then the immediate removal of Confederate statues around the community. This is in Richmond. We're not talking just about the physical monuments to white supremacy. Many of the statues are already in the process of being removed. And so we're talking about monoliths to white supremacy, monoliths to systemic oppression, monoliths to colonization. We're talking about the courthouse. We're talking about the Capitol. We're talking about police forces. We're talking about prisons, VCU buildings that are gentrifying specific areas in Black neighborhoods. These are directly oppressing communities. These are directly gentrifying communities. And as students, we want to make sure that we are pushing and pressuring for the removal of these physical and mental statues. Why is this a fight that students should be engaged in? You know, a lot of VC students go to this university for 4 years, a lot of times living in sort of like a semi-collegiate academic bubble and not being aware of the long-lasting effects VCU has on its community, just taking classes, just living there, taking up space in a place that is not their own. We're demanding that VC students get more involved with the community, understand community demands, support community demands. All of us have a responsibility to demand that VCU take accountability for the harm and destruction it's inflicted upon Richmond. You know, this is something that's intentional, and we want to make sure that VCU is intentionally handling this situation. And we also believe that VCU has not done enough in terms of transparency and accountability directly to students and the community. And it's our pressure, it's our responsibility and obligation to make it right, especially considering that VCU student population is so large. We're an obscene amount of students on campus, and many of which go back home and oftentimes don't really think of the necessity and their place in Richmond. But by going to VCU, you're directly taking up space. So we want to make sure people are acknowledging that.
You summed it up so well, but I do want to like touch on a couple of things you did say in terms of the over-policing and how Black and brown students in particular, also other POC students, are affected by over-policing. Like if we were to do a thought exercise, it would be like, how many times have you as a POC had to wear a backpack or some sort of identifier to show that you're a VCU student when you're around police? And if you're like a white person listening to this, how often have you not had to do that? Because I know for me, it's like, and a lot of other POC, it's like POC people, it's like, that's a consistent struggle. So like also highlighting the fact that like over policing affects all of VCU differently, but still we should be on the same page about it. And just because you don't see that oppression, or maybe you were at a fraternity party and you were able to get away from that drunk because they let you off, doesn't mean that like people of color have that same experience. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to each share one source, something that really has been impacting us recently in terms of, it could be abolition work, it could be student organizing.
Okay, so my resource for the week is something that I actually read maybe a while ago, but I always pick it back up because it just rings so true for me. And a lot of you have probably read it before, but Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde is a Black lesbian poet. And Sister Outsider is a series of essays and speeches and covers a range of topics of Blackness, sexism, homophobia, and doing intentional work within yourself to heal, but also to find your voice. And just one quote that always sticks with me that I just want to share is found in the book is, we do not have to romanticize our past in order to be aware of how its seeds are present. We do not have to suffer the waste of amnesia that robs us of the lessons of the past rather than permit us to read them with pride as well as deep understanding. We know what it is like to be lied to, and we know how important it is to not lie to ourselves. We are powerful because we are survived, and that is what it's all about, survival and growth.
And for my resource, I just want to directly plug Richmond Tenants Union and Leaders of the New South. So currently, some of you may be unaware, but a lot of Richmonders, especially in Black and brown communities, are currently facing eviction right now. And Richmond Tenants Union and Leaders of the New South are currently doing work to hopefully try and stay these evictions. This work is difficult in terms of the systems that we're up against. So I definitely want to divert support over there. A lot of these tenants are being evicted by large corporation landlords. These are people that hold a lot of power in Richmond. So definitely make sure you give them a check out and maybe see how you can get involved as well.
And along with that, I would recommend also following Justice and Reformation on Instagram and Twitter for any community updates. Some of their demands include implementing the Marcus Alert and reopening the case. So I would highly recommend to go onto their Twitter and Instagram for more updates on that.
And then my source is, it's a very contents-dense book, but it's called From Columbus to Castro. It's a history of the Caribbean written from the perspective of Eric Williams, the first prime minister of my family's home country, Trinidad. It's a great read. If you can take the time and really like try and learn the content-dense information, it's a hard read, but you really understand the impact of post-colonialism in the Caribbean and the greater Western world. So I think it's a really good read. With that, thank you guys for listening. This has been Student Power Radio. Remember, plant the seeds to your radical garden.